When Cassie and I bought the house on Greenwood Drive, we thought we'd stumbled on a once-in-a-lifetime deal. It was the perfect place, a cozy stone cottage just outside of town, secluded but not too far from everything we'd need. We even joked that we'd have enough space for a garden and maybe a dog. The previous owner, Mr. Hendricks, had recently passed, and his only son had sold the house almost immediately. The paperwork had been smooth, and within a week, we were moving in. But that's when things started going wrong. On our first day unloading boxes, a man appeared out of nowhere, blocking the doorway. He was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes and hair that looked as if it hadn't been washed in weeks. He had this intense, unblinking stare that pinned us in place. "I'm Evan Hendricks, my father's son," he said, his voice like gravel. There was no warmth, no hint of welcome, just that hard, empty gaze. I tried to shake his hand, but he ignored it. "Listen," he muttered, his eyes darting around the house. "I told them I didn't want this house sold. My father knew that." I'm sorry to hear that," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "But the sale's final, and we are moving in now. No one else should live here," he hissed. "This place was mine and is till mine. If you stay, I'll make your lives hell." Without another word, he turned and walked down the driveway, vanishing into the trees. Cassie and I didn't talk about it that night. I could tell she was rattled, but we brushed it off, telling ourselves that Evan was just grieving. The next few days were quiet, but as the week wore on, we started noticing strange things. Windows left open that we swore we'd closed. A door, locked before bed, would be ajar in the morning. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of soft footsteps. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but as I lay there, I could hear them moving slowly down the hallway. I was wide awake, my heart hammering. I nudged Cassie, but she was deep asleep, oblivious. I crept out of bed, feeling along the walls until I reached the stairs. The footsteps were louder now, shuffling somewhere in the living room below. I took a deep breath, flicked on the light, and nearly gasped. Evan was standing in the center of the room, looking around as if it were his. He looked thinner than before, his skin pale, almost sickly. He turned toward me slowly, his eyes hollow, like he was looking through me. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Get out, or I'm calling the police." He didn't answer, just kept staring with this blank expression. Then he took a step toward me, and his face contorted into a twisted grin. "I told you this was mine," he whispered. "You shouldn't have come here." And then, as I was rooted in place, he said something that chilled me to the bone. "Did he tell you what he left behind?" "My father. He kept things down here. Secrets. Things he couldn't live with." I'd heard enough. I rushed forward, ready to shove him out. But just as I reached him, he turned and slipped out the back door, melting into the shadows. I locked every door and window in the house that night, but sleep didn't come. Over the next few days, Cassie and I tried to go about life as usual, though neither of us could shake the tension. I couldn't tell her what Evan had said, but at night, I lay awake, wondering what he'd meant. What secrets was he talking about? Then, 3 nights later, I woke up to Cassie shaking me, her face pale. "Mark," she whispered, "there's something in the basement. I don't know. It sounded like someone crying." We grabbed a flashlight and went down the creaking basement stairs together. The air was thick and musty, and the beam of light barely cut through the darkness. In the far corner, something glinted on the floor. An old, rusted latch hidden beneath a loose floorboard. I pulled it up, my hands shaking. Underneath was a small, padlocked box. Cassie's face was pale as she whispered, "Do you think?" I didn't answer. Instead, I forced the lock open. Inside was an old photograph of Evan as a child, along with a single yellowed page. I held it up to the light and read it, my pulse racing. It was a letter written in shaky handwriting. The letter revealed everything. Evan's father had kept him confined in the house for most of his life, never allowing him to leave. He'd been tormented, isolated, and kept hidden, and his mother had been forced to flee, leaving Evan alone with his father's harsh discipline. Mr. Hendricks had controlled him, forced him to stay in the house, locked away from the world. As I looked up from the letter, I saw a figure at the top of the stairs. It was Evan, his face twisted with rage, his eyes hollow with memories of a life spent in captivity. "This house is mine," he snarled, "and I'll make sure you never take it from me." He turned and vanished into the night. The police were called, but they never found him. Cassie and I left the house that night and never went back. Every so often, I'll hear a story about a couple who tried to move into that old stone house, only to leave with tales of a shadowy figure stalking the halls and a man whispering that it would always belong to him. When Jess and I moved into our new home, we thought we'd finally found a peaceful, suburban escape. The house was charming, the lawn neatly trimmed, and the neighbors seemed friendly enough, if a bit too curious. The couple next door, Ed and Jasmine, were the first to introduce themselves. They were older, maybe in their late 50s, with the kind of put-together look that screamed, "Everything's perfect in our lives." Ed and Jasmine were friendly, but in a way that felt a little off. Ed, in particular, had an intense stare. He'd stand outside their house every morning, watching as Jess and I left for work, and every evening, he'd be here watching as we came home. At first, Jess and I laughed about it, chalking it up to small-town habits. But the more we saw them, the more unsettling it became. A few weeks in, we started noticing other strange things. Jasmine would sometimes come over, often unannounced, with little gifts, fresh-baked cookies, a potted plant, a book she thought we'd like. She was polite, but her eyes would scan our entryway, as though she were taking mental notes. Her eyes always lingered on Jess a little too long, and she'd ask odd questions like, "How are you sleeping here?" Or, "Have you been adjusting well?" One evening, Jess and I had just finished dinner when there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Ed standing there, hands in his pockets, that same unreadable expression on his face. "Mind if I come in?" he asked, without waiting for an answer. He stepped inside, looking around as if he were the one giving us a tour of our own home. Can we help you with something?" I asked, my unease growing. Ed turned to me, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Just thought I'd check in, see how you two are settling in. This house, well, it's been through a lot over the years." Jess looked at me, her eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" "Oh, nothing you need to worry about," he said, though his gaze drifted to the hallway as if he could see something we couldn't. "Just history, I guess. You know how old houses are. They hold on to things." That line gave me chills. Before I could press him on what he meant, he gave a short nod and let himself out, leaving us standing in silence. That night, as Jess and I were getting ready for bed, she turned to me, whispering, "I think they're hiding something. Did you see the way he looked at the hallway? It was like he knew something." I nodded, still thinking about Ed's strange words. But I brushed it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. After all, people were entitled to be a little odd, right? Then the noises started. Late that night, just as we were drifting off to sleep, we heard a faint tapping sound. I sat up, straining to hear, but it stopped as soon as I focused on it. I told myself it was probably just the house settling, but as the nights went on, the noises grew louder. The soft taps became slow, deliberate knocks, always from somewhere deep within the walls. One night, Jess woke me up, her face pale. At first, I thought it was just more knocking, but this time, I could make out a faint whisper. It was muffled, like someone speaking just below the floorboards. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was desperate, pleading. We barely slept after that. I could tell Jess was afraid to say it, but we both felt it. Someone or something was trying to get our attention. The next day, we decided to do some digging into the history of the house. We spent hours in the town library, combing through old newspapers, trying to figure out what could explain the strange feeling that clung to our new home. We didn't find much, but just as we were about to give up, I stumbled on a brief mention in an article from 20 years ago. Local couple Ed and Jasmine. Blackwood helped police investigate a missing persons case. I kept reading, my hands starting to shake. The article detailed the disappearance of a young woman who had lived in our house. She'd gone missing under strange circumstances, and neighbors had reported seeing her acting confused and distressed in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. The last people to see her alive? Ed and Jasmine. When we got home, the last traces of daylight were fading. As we pulled into the driveway, Ed was standing outside, watching us with that same eerie smile. But this time, there was something else in his expression. Something dark, as if he knew what we'd just found out. That night, the noises were worse than ever. Jess and I lay awake, listening to faint footsteps echoing in the walls, getting closer, then retreating, only to come back again. And then, just before dawn, we both heard it clear as day. A woman's voice, hoarse and pleading, whispering, "Help me, please." In a panic, we decided we couldn't stay another night in that house. We packed bags and were ready to leave, but as I stepped out to the car, Ed was waiting at the end of our driveway. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, tilting his head with that unsettling smile. He took a slow step toward us, lowering his voice. "Some things don't like to be left behind, you know? They might just follow you." We didn't answer. We got in the car, our hands shaking as we pulled out of the driveway and sped down the road. I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped anything at all. Who was the woman whose voice we had heard, and what had truly happened to her in that house? What secrets did Ed and Jasmine hide behind their perfect facade, and how far would they go to keep the past buried? When I first moved into the house at the end of Hawthorne Lane, I thought I'd found a hidden gem. The price had been surprisingly low for such a large, old property, but I convinced myself it was just due to its age. My only real concern was that it was so isolated. No neighbors, a winding drive that led through trees that grew denser with every mile, and not even a streetlight for a good stretch. But I'd always wanted a quiet place to call my own, so I ignored any reservations and settled in. The first night, things were peaceful. The house was old, and it creaked and groaned as old houses do, but nothing that seemed out of place. It wasn't until the second night that things got strange. Started around midnight. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard the distinct sound of footsteps creaking down the upstairs hallway. I froze, listening, convinced my tired mind was playing tricks on me. But the steps continued, slow and steady, moving closer to my bedroom door. My heart raced as I lay there, clutching the sheets, waiting for something to happen. But after a few minutes, the footsteps stopped. The next morning, I laughed it off, chalking it up to the old house settling. That night, the footsteps returned, closer this time. I tried to reason with myself that it was nothing, but the sound was too clear, too rhythmic to ignore. I even felt a chill run down my spine as the creaking grew louder and finally stopped right outside my door. And then I heard it, a faint, muffled whisper, like someone was speaking just on the other side of the door. The voice was hoarse, rasping out words I couldn't understand. I didn't sleep much that night. Over the next week, the sounds became more frequent. Every night, the footsteps returned, closer and closer, always stopping just outside my door. Then, one night, I woke up to find the door to my room slightly open. I know I had locked it before going to bed, but there it was, a narrow gap revealing only darkness beyond. Panicking, I sat up, scanning the room. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the floor just past the doorway, there were faint, wet footprints, bare footprints that shouldn't have been there. They led from the hallway to my bed and then stopped. The following morning, I checked every window, every door. All were securely locked. Yet every night, without fail, the footprints would appear, a little closer to my bed each time. By the end of the week, sleep was impossible. I spent my nights clutching a flashlight, my eyes darting around the room, waiting for any sign of movement. The footprints were there every morning, growing closer and closer until one night they stopped, right beside my bed. That night, I didn't dare turn off the light, but around 3 in the morning, exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep with the light still on. I woke up suddenly, feeling something cold and clammy graze my cheek. My eyes flew open, and there, looming over me, was a figure. A shadowy silhouette with empty eyes and a face that looked like it had been twisted and stretched into a permanent, silent scream. I scrambled out of bed, throwing myself across the room, but when I looked back, the figure was gone. The door was still open, the footprints leading right up to where I'd been lying. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. I grabbed my keys, fled the house, and never looked back. I left everything behind. Furniture, belongings, all of it. It's been a few months since I left, and every so often, I think about driving back just to see if someone else has moved in. But every time I remember that night and the sound of those footsteps creeping closer, I decide it's best to leave Hawthorne Lane and its secrets buried in the past. When Emma and I bought our new house, we thought it would be our fresh start. The place was a bit of a fixer-upper, but we loved it, the quaint architecture, the big backyard, and the history the realtor had mentioned. It had been empty for a while, after the last owner passed away without any family to inherit it. Our first week there was spent doing the usual, unpacking, exploring, and tackling little repairs. One day, while Emma was at work, I decided to check out the attic. I had this vision of converting it into an art studio for her, so I figured I'd start by seeing how much work it needed. The attic was small and dusty, with that heavy, stale air that clings to old spaces. I noticed right away that the only thing in there was a large, full-length mirror, propped up against the far wall and draped in an old sheet. Something about it made me uneasy, but I figured it was just the classic creepiness of an attic. I lifted the sheet, expecting a cracked or foggy mirror, but it was perfect, pristine, even. The wood frame was dark and intricately carved, with odd symbols etched around the edges. I dusted it off, shrugged, and decided to keep it there as part of the studio I was planning. That night, Emma and I were watching a movie when we both heard a faint creak from above us. We paused, listening, but after a few moments of silence, we dismissed it. Old houses make noise, right? But then it happened again, louder this time. A dragging, scraping sound, like furniture being moved across the floor. Emma gave me a worried look. "Did you put something in the attic?" "No," I said, feeling a chill. "Just an old mirror that was already up there." We decided to check it out, climbing the narrow stairs with a flashlight in hand. The attic looked just as I'd left it, except the mirror was no longer against the far wall. It had somehow shifted closer to the attic door, like it had been pulled a few feet forward. We looked at each other, both a bit shaken but too stubborn to admit it. I pushed the mirror back to its original spot, and we left, reassuring ourselves that we'd just imagined the whole thing. But as we were leaving, I glanced over my shoulder and felt a cold chill run down my spine. I could have sworn I saw a dark shape, almost like a shadow, standing in the mirror's reflection, just for a second. Over the next few nights, things only got stranger. I'd hear soft, faint whispers coming from the attic when I was alone in the house, like a quiet, hissing chant I couldn't quite make out. Doors started closing on their own, and Emma kept waking up at exactly 3:12 a.m., convinced she'd heard footsteps on the stairs. Then one night, I woke up to a horrible noise, something banging and scraping against the ceiling, coming from the attic. I sat up, heart racing, and that's when I saw it. The mirror had somehow made its way out of the attic and was now standing at the top of our bedroom stairs. I stared, barely breathing, as a figure emerged in the mirror's reflection, pale with hollow, sunken eyes and a twisted, malicious grin. It didn't move, but its gaze seemed locked onto me, like it was staring straight into my soul. I shook Emma awake, and when she saw it, she gasped, clutching onto my arm. I don't think it wants us here," she whispered. Summoning every ounce of courage, I approached the mirror, determined to get it out of the house. But as I got closer, the reflection grew darker, the figure's face twisting into something unnatural, as if it was pressing against the glass, desperate to break through. I grabbed the mirror, lugging it back up to the attic with Emma by my side, both of us too afraid to look into it. We locked the attic door that night and blocked it with a chair, neither of us daring to sleep. Every now and then, We'd hear that soft whispering from above, like it was calling to us, luring us to look again. By dawn, we'd had enough. We left the house only grabbing what we needed and sold it without a second thought. Sometimes, though, I wonder about that mirror. Did we trap something inside it, or did it escape after we left? I don't think I'll ever know, but sometimes I'll catch a glimpse of something in a reflection, just for a second, like a pale face or a twisted grin. And every time I have to wonder, did it follow us, or did it just find another mirror and another person to haunt?